Welcome everyone! One of the things I really love about the older generation of players is that their playing styles were clearly more unique than the playing styles today. They didn't have engines that told them they were playing quote-unquote bad openings or that they didn't play the critical lines. They just had a certain approach to the game, they had their pet opening systems, and when you were paired against them and you have to figure out a lot more over the board, then their quote-unquote unsound play may be very difficult. Well, one of the players with a very unique and creative playing style was the Danish GM Bent Larsen, but despite that he was one of the top players for many years, and today you'll see one of his great games. Of course, he really pioneered the opening 1b3, it was also named after him, but today he'll play an even more unconventional opening. In this game from 1958, he played the also very unique Tigran Petrosian. Larsen had white and he opened with f4. It's called the bird opening and it's very aggressive. It could get into a kind of reverse Dutch. If you check what Stockfish thinks, then it'll say that white is already worse, but Larsen wouldn't care about that at all. The only thing that matters is that you play the position better than your opponent. Anyway, on with the game. Knight f6 by Petrosian, knight f3, d5. If white doesn't claim the center, then black will. And after e3, another very logical move by Petrosian, bishop to g4. So by pinning and possibly even trading bishop for knight, he wants to gain control over e5. And if he does trade off his light square bishop, then he'll go c6, and those pawns will still be covering some light squares. Bishop e2 unpins the knight, knight b d7, and here somewhat surprisingly knight e5 by Larsen, so simply allowing black to trade bishops, even though white's light squares may end up pretty weak because of that, but he still has a good knight on e5 for now at least. Trading that wouldn't be good for black. After pawn takes, knight d7 and d4, white has nice center pawns and black is somewhat cramped. So instead e6, and after castles and bishop d6, Larsen decided to create a stone wall structure, starting with d4, and after he follows up with c3, he'll have this really solid central pawn chain, and this helps keeping the position closed, and by doing that he can actually consider going for the aggressive g2, g4. You don't want to try that when the center is open. It continued with castles, knight d2, c5 and c3, and after rook to c8, Larsen did go for it with g4, which is really ambitious, especially since white doesn't have his light squared bishop anymore. You can imagine if the bishop were still on c2 or d3, white could easily get a dangerous attack after kicking black's knight with g5. Nevertheless, Larsen is still playing for the win, but Petrosian has a plan. He went knight to e8, and he first plans to bring his other knight to e4, and then he wants to kick white's knight with f6. Then knights from d to f3, knight of 6, bishop d2, connecting the rooks, but as you can see, Larsen does only have this bad bishop left, it's just stuck behind all these pawns. Then as planned, knight to e4, and maybe it's worth considering simply leaving the bishop there. If I were white, I'd be happy if black would trade that strong knight for this stupid bishop, but Larsen still retreated. Maybe the bishop will be useful on the king side. But Petrosian just continues as planned with f6, driving away white's strong knight. But now Petrosian may have made a little slip. He went bishop e7, which isn't a bad move at all, but it does let Larsen seize the initiative. Maybe he could have considered c4, and after knight f2 first strengthen the c pawn with b5, and maybe in the long term undermine white's pawns with a5 and b4. And if white trades on e4 and goes knight to d2, then he could also stop white from going f5 by playing f5 himself, and certainly this doesn't look dangerous for black. However, after bishop e7, which was played in the game, Larsen didn't hesitate to go f5 himself, and kind of unexpectedly, it's the light squares in black's camp that get under pressure, and white's pieces will improve as well. The knight can hop to f4, the bishop could occupy a nice diagonal from g3. That's the activity that Larsen is playing for. Queen d7 was next, guarding the pawn. Knight h4, again going for activity. And here I guess we would expect knight to d6. Petrosian went knight to c7 instead. Let's briefly check knight d6 anyway. Maybe Petrosian didn't like knight to f4 in this position, attacking the e-pawn. And black does need to be careful actually. If black would take on f5 and then think he can simply win that f-pawn, then queen g4 is a killer move. White threatens the knight, which is pinned to the queen. And if g6 to defend, then white can sack on g6, and now the knight is hanging again, and knight takes rook could also be played. So maybe Petrosian simply felt guarding e6 was very important. Therefore, going back to the game, knight c7 instead. But now that bad bishop on e1 does end up on a good square, bishop g3 was played, controlling some of the key dark squares. White would love it if black surrenders that knight on e4 to take the bishop, but Petrosian didn't want to. He instead offered a bishop trade, which was accepted. But it's here, after rook from a to d1, that Petrosian missed a better move. He went rook from c to e8, but perhaps he should have gone c4 to keep the position closed. And after knight to f4, he again has this ready-made plan with b5 and again undermine the pawns with a5 and b4. That didn't happen, he went rook from c to e8, but here Larsen first took on c5. And after knight f4 starting to put pressure on d5, Petrosian really begins to lose his way. He would still be more than fine if he'd gone e5 here, so giving up the d-pawn, queen d2 threatens to win the knight back, and after rook d8, c4 does win the knight back, but here Petrosian could play queen to a6, and after white recaptures on d5, black takes on a2, and if anyone is in danger here, it would be white. However, going back to the game, Petrosian instead played b5, preventing c3, c4, but Larsen now increased the pressure with queen to g2. Now he's planning to take on e6 and then win the d5 pawn. And even though Petrosian was famous for his defensive skills, he did pick the wrong defense here. Petrosian basically sacrificed the pawn with rook to d8, but queen e5 was possible, counterattacking e3. And after pawn takes e6, queen takes and queen f2, they would enter a roughly equal endgame, and certainly Petrosian would never lose this. But instead rook d8 was played, and there's a tactical problem with this. b4 is a great move by Larsen, forcing the knight to a less stable square on e4. Larsen took. g6, white wanted to go knight to f5 and e7, g6 stops that. But now you see why e4 is a bad square for the knight. Knight takes d5, removes the defender, and for now white is even 2 pawns up. Black did win a pawn back after knight takes c3, but after this queen trade and rook to a6, Larsen still in the driving seat. Petrosian does have counterplay though, white also has weak pawns. After rook takes a7, rook e8 targets a second pawn. Knight g2 defends e3 for now, but it also plans knight to f4, so g5. But now the other rook gets involved, which also stops rook takes pawn, because rook c8 would lead to checkmate. Petrosian therefore brought the rook back to take the pawn that way, but now it's starting to look desperate. First h4, if black takes, then the white knight will hop from h4 to f5, so Petrosian didn't take and took the e-pawn off. But now Larsen got 2 rooks on the 7th rank. Black's best was maybe h6, but even this is looking awful after first rook g7, rook h7, and then a check from the second rook, and then rook to b7 threatens with mate on h8, and when that is stopped, the h-pawn drops anyway. Petrosian instead brought the knight back, but now it's really over. Rook takes pawn. Petrosian did go rook to c8, but it's too late for counterplay. Rook check was next. Now if king to f8, then h5, and running the h-pawn up the board is a simple win. So king to h8, but h5 is still a good move. Knight e8 attacks the rook. The rook dodged that and threatens with mate on f8, so the knight went back. But now let's see Larsen's winning plan. First, rook check, king g8, and then h6. This pawn plays a crucial role in winning the game. Knight e8 was still tried, but after rook from h to f7, Petrosian resigned. The threat is h7 check and then mate on f8. If therefore knight d6, then there is yet another way to win. Rook g7 check. If now king to h8, then it's mate in 3 after rook h7, rook g7, and rook h8 mate. And if king to f8, then h7 and either rook to g8 or promoting the pawn will end the game. Very nicely done and very bold play by Larsen. Let's briefly check a couple of key moments. After opening the game with f4, Larsen constructed this very ambitious stonewall setup and went on the offensive with g4 even though he didn't have his good bishop anymore. Petrosian wasn't in danger right away, in fact his position was fine, but when Larsen got to play f5 he really was in his element, and slowly Petrosian started to lose his way. Larsen first got to play queen g2, pressuring d5. Larsen then exploited the weak position of the knight, winning the d-pawn. Soon Larsen got into a favorable endgame, and once he had both rooks on the 7th rank and also involved the passed h-pawn, he quickly wrapped up a great game. Well, I think we can all appreciate bold play and daring to take risks. Let me end with a quote from Larsen. When you take risks, sometimes you'll lose and sometimes you'll win, but you'll only remember the win. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this game too. If you did, please simply like the video and subscribe if you want to see more. There'll be more chess this weekend, so I'll be seeing you guys again soon, and take care.